I've always been a fan of Eldar in all its forms. Craft World, Dark Eldar, Clown or Dinosaur, I just love me some space elves. So you can imagine my excitement last year when they got a refresh of their range. Obviously, the most exciting model was the avatar of Khaine, which I definitely would have made a video about if I hadn't got busy around that time. Well, now I'm back painting and making videos, and I wanted a big demon boy for my army, damn it! However, as we all saw more accounts painting an avatar than we could ever know what to do with, it seemed a bit redundant at this point. I've missed my chance to be one of the cool kids. Sad. Enter 3D printing, and I found this amazing model, the Cosmic Entity by Fantasy Cult Miniatures. This guy has an epic look to rival that of the avatar, but without forcing you to sit through another video of one being painted. I had a fun plan for the majority of the armour of the model. I wanted to tackle that right at the end, so we'll talk a bit more about it then. So, I started with the crystals growing out from the dude and the sword, which I want to be like an icy blue, going full opposite to the flamey avatar of Khaine. I started by basing them with a 50-50 mix of Game Colour's ultramarine blue and just a basic black. I just watered this down and used a basic brush to lay it all down. Next I used ultramarine blue on its own. I took advantage of the nice shapes by dry brushing over these. This was quite a heavy layer as I only wanted the dark in the deepest parts. I also focused towards the ends as I want them to get lighter as they move away from its skin. These wide, round brushes are amazing. I'd recommend trying them if you haven't before. So dry brushing is a quick method, and I was able to move straight on to Citadel's Lothan Blue. Keeping the bristles very slightly moist as you go means that the paint won't actually dry on the bristles, so you can keep moving paints and then only give it a good, solid clean right at the end. I then did the exact same thing with model colour Sky Blue, now focusing on mostly the highest areas and the edges of the longer crystals. On the sword I'm focusing further and further to the end, but also trying to hit the edge of the jagged blade thing that he has. I finished this section with model colour Off-White. For this part I made sure to get rid of almost all the paint, so I only caught the very ends. I plan to touch up every part at the end, so for now this part's done. After that I handled all the parts with the musculature and between armour bits. I used Citadel's Basilicanum Grey for this. These are parts I don't need to draw attention to as there's plenty of other vibrant and colourful things going on. So I start with a simple contrast and then highlight with some Game Colour Stonewall Grey. Then I pick out the highest details with Off-White. These are watered down quite a bit so they don't fully cover, and done in just a quick sketchy way to establish the basic scheme. Using Game Colour Warlord Purple, I base coat the hair and sash. This one is to tie it all into the rest of my Eldar. I water this down quite a lot and use 2 coats just to make sure I don't lose any hair detail. Next, I shade these with Citadel's Caraberg Crimson. I get quite a lot of this on my brush and then glob it onto the model and then kind of use the brush to move it around, being careful to wick off any excess from areas that might start pooling. I re-established the Warlock Purple again, leaving the shade in the recesses. Using model colour Fluorescent Magenta, I then go and add more highlights. For the cloth I focus on edges, flat areas and towards the bottom. And for the hair I just pick certain spots to highlight more so that the hair appears shimmery. Then I mix in some off-white for stronger highlights, following the same process as the last step. I use a solid black for the cloak at the back. I simply thin this down a little and cover the entire cloak. I highlight using Citadel's Eshin Grey, picking out all the folds and edges. I watered this down quite a lot so I could take it as a kind of glaze, changing the colour very little on each pass. The reason for this is that it can be quite easy to highlight black until it looks like grey, so I just wanted to avoid this. Onto the gems, and these are surprisingly easy to get a really nice effect on. I based these with Game Extra Opaque Heavy Black Green. I carefully went around picking out all of these, including the ones on the sword. I watered it down enough for it to run into the recesses, and this helped provide some definition before any layering had gone on. So onto this method. In case you've never painted gems before, the easy way to do it is highlight opposite to the rest of the model. This is because the glass kind of allows light to pass through but then bounces and refracts most at the bottom. So I take Game Colours Turquoise and highlight all the gems in the bottom 2/3. Next I use Model Colour Sky Blue and highlight a kind of crescent shape into the bottom third. Finally, using a pure white, barely even watered down, I add a glimmer to the tops of the gems. This is done with just a simple dot or two along the top. I also add a lower glimmer to some of the larger gems just to make them appear a bit more vibrant and sparkly. Right, finally, all that's left is the armour, and I'd like to get some definition before putting my colours on. So I take Citadel's Draconoff Nightshade and put targeted bits into the cracks and lines between the panels. As I'm doing this before highlights, I don't need to be too neat over the grey base coat. I start the main colour by using my pure white to colour the armour. I water this down a lot as white is well known for looking lumpy or like chalky if you're not careful. Also, I don't really need it the full on white right now. Although I follow all the steps after this, I stop at the head, shoulder and chest to make sure I'm happy with the effect I want to achieve before wasting all my time across the entire model. So, onto the effect. As I was trying to decide what kind of scheme I was going to use for this, a video dropped by Rogue Hobbies where Louise painted a Rainbow Warrior Space Marine. In that she did a prismatic power sword and it just looked amazing. So I had to try it in much larger fashion obviously. So I start with Squid Pink, and as it's a glaze I use the gamer version. This is meant to be used through an airbrush so it starts out quite thin, and I always find them quite useful for getting a glaze because they start pre-thinned for you. Without much rhyme or reason, for each surface I picked one end to slowly glaze with the pink. Where edges meet, I tried to do the colour on opposite ends. So in case you haven't used this technique before, glazing is done with paint so thinned that it only tints the colour with each pass. It's always best to end the brushstroke where the colour will be strongest, as this is where the most paint will sit. Ideally you want layers so thin that they dry almost instantly, then you can build layers fairly quickly and you get a nice smooth effect. I use my sky blue in the exact same way, glazing colour on the opposite ends of each edge. Then, to shift the blue into a green, I used Demonic Yellow by Army Painter. This was glazed in the same way over the blue. Because I was going back and forth on this, it was really useful to have these out on my wet palette. If you've never tried one of these, I would definitely recommend giving it a go. They're really useful for keeping your paints really thinned and just there ready to go. So sometimes it would look more stripy than a prismatic colour shift, so I'd glaze back down to a white and try the colours somewhere else. To carry on making sure I like the full effect, I went to edge highlighting with pure white. I used this minimally thinned because I wanted it to look bright and bold. I did all the edge highlighting and those awesome little crack details. Once I'd got this finished and I was happy this was the direction I wanted to go, I went back through those steps for all the other armour. And let me tell you, this was a huge leap to go from one sword to an entire massive mini like this. After hours of glazing, I was kind of regretting my life choices. Was it worth it in the end? You decide. So now I was happy with the mini overall, I just wanted to do some touch-ups. I started with Lothan Blue and glazed it over with the sword and crystals to add some of that blue back in. Then I took my white and added some stronger highlight to those areas. These two steps really made the crystals pop. I was quite happy with that. Then I decided to smooth the lines in the grey musculature, so I watered down Stonewall Grey into almost a glaze consistency and slowly built up transitions between the light and dark areas of the muscle. Any areas that I felt ended up too light, I used Eshin Grey in the same way, bringing the tones back down. On the hair, I went back to the fluorescent magenta and dry brushed it back over the white, as I kind of felt I'd used a bit too much white and it was making the hair look too pale and desaturated. I was happy with the model at this point, so just needed to do the base. Here I wanted to keep the cool palette, so I picked Citadel Genestealer Purple and Fantasy Game Joralden Turquoise. After laying down some purple, I quickly added the turquoise and mixed them together on the Mini. This is a very rough version of wet blending. Where paint had already dried, I just added more in so I could mix between the two colours and create the gradients. Later steps would mean it didn't matter too much if this looked messy, and it did. Next, I took Citadel Fulgrim Pink and used a heavy but targeted dry brush. I decided to take this up to the attachment points on the cloth and feet so it would look like the energy was kind of lighting those areas. Then I went back to my pure white again and dry brushed on a smaller area. I tried to make them solid but narrow areas, creating the illusion that this is like a beam of energy. To neaten this up, I used a normal brush afterwards and painted on where I wanted it to look like the energy was brightest, creating kind of tendrils of energy. Finally, I used the same scheme on this as I used for the rest of my Aeldar's base. I base coated it with Game Colour's Beastly Brown and washed it with Agrac's Earthshade. Instead of highlighting it with a lighter brown, I went back to Fulgrim Pink with a brief dry brush to give the appearance that the ground was being lit by the same energy. So there we go. Because of my short attention span, I generally try and use speed painting methods, stuff like slap chop and just zenithal highlighting and contrast. But with this model I kind of wanted to use more classic techniques and get some cool effects. I do think the prismatic effect came out really well and I can't wait to use this in a game.